And this is the podcast title. This is the title of the show. Gimme, gimme, gimme. Right? Because we're in service to self mentality. And I'm entitled and I deserve that. You know? How about stop allowing yourself to be robbed and spend your money how you want to spend it by not paying taxes? You know? Stop allowing these psychopaths to take from you. Find methods of doing runarounds around their system by whatever means necessary to do it. And don't contribute into their taxation system of slavery. And then put your money where you want to put it. Voluntarily. You know, but this is everybody's attitude. Gimme, 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 because I'm entitled. I deserve to get it for free. Even though somebody else labored to create it, to produce it, to distribute it. It's because there's no respect for property. No respect for property rights. See, in their whole attitude, there should be no such thing as property. Well, if you dump property, you dump rights with it. Because if you understand natural law, all rights are property rights. There can't be rights without property. And think about it, it's the word proper means right. It's moral, it's proper, it's right. We use the words to mean the same thing. That's not accidental. Those words were chosen to mean the same thing for very specific reasons. So, why do the millennials have this mentality? Okay? They have this mentality of instant gratification. First of all, who are the millennials that I'm talking about? Who are the millennial generations? Who is the millennial generation? So the millennial generation could be defined as Generation Y, in between X and Z. I'm a Generation Xer. I come from Generation X. Born between the years 1965 and 1980. I was born in 1974, right in the middle of Gen X. Okay? You know, and Gen Xers are more like focused on sort of a vocation, you know? They're not like drifters from one project or career to another, or, you know, they're generally like identify with like doing a vocation of some type, a task that they are very good at. Gen Y is more, you know, float from job to job or work from company to company, mostly because there isn't a lot of job security anymore. But it's like, you know, they don't really have that like sort of vocational idea about what they want to do in life. So they're more drifters. They're also highly focused on self, service to self mentality. Not all of them. Again, these are generalities, not blanket statements in this case. Again, some blanket statements are true and sometimes I'll make them. In this case, I'm making generalities, generalized statements that are largely true, but not always. Okay? Generation Y is born between the years 1981 and 1996. Some people will place that slightly higher. I've heard, you know, 84 to 97 to 98. It's in that region, okay? You know, early 80s to mid 90s to even late 90s, okay? And they're highly focused on it's like these are the people I was talking about last week that think the personal computer is over with. We don't need high-end desktops or laptops. We could just use tablets and smartphones, okay? They're always in their phone. They're always in social media, obsessed with social media. This generation is obsessed with social media. Status on social media is like their life's goal, okay? And thinking that I can do everything on my cell phone. I can do everything on my tablet. Well, actually, no, you can't. And that was a deliberate effort on the part of the social engineers to get you off of a truly creative platform like a powerful personal desktop computer, okay, or a powerful laptop computer. All right, that's who we're talking about here. Okay, so this has been also called the me generation, and there we have it again: mini-me Satanism, me, gimme, instant gratification. You know, my generation has some of that, but not to the extent that the next generation does. Now, Generation Z, I'm hearing good things about, that are seeing all the bullshit of Gen Y, of the millennials, and going, good God, how did we let it get this bad? And they're stepping up and doing something about it already, as young as they are. You know, they're realizing how totally fucked their parents are. You know, how fucked up in the head that they are. And realizing how fucked they're making the world. And they're basically saying, no, we got to do something about this. Some of them, not all of them, but, you know, a portion of them are waking up just by the nature of how mentally screwed up their parents' generation is. Okay? And guess what? I'll blame it right on my generation. My generation made Gen Y. Gen X produced Gen Y. Okay? We produced the millennials. My generation produced the millennial generations because largely my generation was so screwed up from the baby boomer generation that created us that we passed the nonsense right down to the children that my generation produced and created the millennials. It seems like the cycle is being interrupted a little bit. I'm not going to use the word completely broken, but it's not progressing in a cyclical pattern as it did over the last 3 generations. Something's going on with Gen Z that isn't the way that the social engineers are really planning for it. Now, that being said, let's see how it plays out. I'm not prophesying anything there, okay? I'm saying that I think they have a little bit better of a chance, the Gen Z, younger generation does, than the millennials, because the millennials have, when I mean the mind control worked perfectly upon them. When I mean it worked perfectly, I mean it went flawlessly. The machine had not one kink in it during the formational years of Gen Y at all. The social engineers, I have to give them a round of applause. I mean, you guys, brilliant work, okay? They're no joke. These people are not a joke. The social engineers who programmed Generation Y with their belief systems did a flawless job, I have to say, okay? A flawless job. Because I have never seen in my life a more brainwashed generation. Ever. Ever. Okay? And thank God your children aren't listening to your bullshit. Thank God. Okay? That's all I have to say. You know? Thank God your children are infinitely smarter than the dunces that you are. Most of them. Most of them. I'm not talking to every single person in that generation, because there are some that are legitimately awake. Okay? But I'm talking to the vast majority as a whole, as a group. Okay? You're not going to get done to your children the mind fuck job that the previous generation unfortunately allowed to happen to you. It's not going to happen with your children. Okay? There's too much information, too much data, and they're just a little bit more streetwise than you are. Okay? And they're not buying the lies that you bought from the mainstream media. Because let me tell you something, folks. This generation, they'll portray them in the media as, oh, they're always on their cell phone. They are addicted to mainstream media. Addicted. Addicted. Okay? And you want to say, oh, they don't watch as much television. They watch just as much television, and they watch TV in other forms. Just because they're not watching TV on a television doesn't mean that they're not paying attention to the mainstream media on other devices. Okay? Just because they absorb the same bullshit on a different device doesn't mean they're not taking the same bullshit into their minds. Okay? So this is who Generation Y is, the millennial generation. Okay, and this is what I'm talking about, that has this attitude of, I need it on my terms. I'm not interested in your daily work or what you have to go through, or your routine, your schedule, your hardships. It's me, me, me. Is this gonna be better for me? Well, then do it, even if it's harder for you. Okay? That's their whole mentality. Their mentality is, I care about only me. It's a satanic mindset. Okay, Satanism was very much propagandized to this generation of individuals, and they bought into it hardcore. What else was very much propagandized to these individuals was socialism. Okay, socialism was the long march through the cultural institutions. the Gramsci plan coming out of the Frankfurt School of Germany, okay, was brought into the mindset of the millennial generation in a hardcore form, more so than any other generation on earth. And that was done through the university systems of North America, specifically the United States, and of all the European countries. The university system is where the communists and socialists decided to spread their tentacles through. Okay? And that's where they decided that they were going to actually concretize and conduct the long march through the institutions, the plan of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist. Okay? Read about him, read about the Frankfurt School, which was, said that conquering a nation militaristically with communism and then bringing it to the rest of the world is not the way to do it. That you would have to extend your tentacles to the far corners of the earth and then conquer the world culturally. Conquer each nation culturally, weaken its people, weaken the sexes, divide people along all kinds of boundaries, which we talked about on former shows about division, and then conquer them through cultural means. And that was called the Long March through the cultural institutions. And it has worked flawlessly. And it has worked most flawlessly on Generation Y, the millennial generation. They bought into that whole plan of divide and rule, divide and conquer, bringing in socialism and eventually communism through cultural mechanisms. Okay? That is the mindset that largely their parents pushed them into, that came out of the socialist schools of thought of the 1960s and 70s, okay, that invaded this country through Soviet Russia and other places in Europe. This is why we see millennials propagating socialism so much in the modern world and saying, we don't want a capitalistic society, not that we have one. They don't even understand that what they think capitalism is actually cronyism, or what is known as crony capitalism, which is a collusion between government and corporate power. It's not real capitalism, okay? And they want now to bring in what they call, and many politicians in the world today like Sanders and Cortez are calling democratic socialism. So here are basically communist flag wavers that are waving, flags akin to the hammer and sickle, although, they're not putting the hammer and sickle on it, or, the Chinese star, just straight red flags, and calling it democratic socialism. And, look at the age group, folks. The age group is exactly the people that I'm talking about. We're talking about people in their mid-20s to early 30s who are getting, politically, quote, active in the political circles and attempting to change the United States into a communist country, which would then, of course, eventually fall into outright totalitarianism through communism, as it always does throughout human history, whenever attempted. And they'll just give you these lines like, oh, it hasn't been done right. Yeah, Stalin just didn't starve enough people, Mao just didn't have enough people murdered, that's all. So, they think that we're going to get out of the crony capitalism by going into the opposite polarity, which is called socialism. And they want to do it through a blending between what they consider democracy and socialism. And all this is, folks, is like, well, we're going to use the mechanisms of government to have voting. And we're going to basically, even if people are wrong and, 51% of people vote to cannibalize the other 49, well, then it was passed through law and it was democratic. And so, dive in with your forks and knives and chop up your fellow beings, because it was put to a vote and it was democratically done, That's what the real mechanisms of government are all about. That's all they've ever been about. They've never been about anything else except violence through coercive control. That's it. And you do that through voting. And if the vast majority wants to commit whatever heinous acts of violence they want to commit, well, hey, you voted on it, Forget individual rights. This is about the majority rules, It's about collectivism and majority rules. Well, guess what? Most of the time, the majority is wrong. Most of the time, the majority is immoral. You have to go down to the individual principles, individual rights, if you're going to get to truth, if you're going to get to real principles, if you're going to get to real values. Okay? And if you're ever going to get to real freedom, you certainly need to get down to individual principles and rights. But yeah, here's the Democratic Socialists of America. And I want you to take a look at all the faces. I want you to take a look at the age group. It's a very nice, neatly packed age range, isn't it? There's no very, very young people. And there's certainly no people with any gray hairs in the head. There's certainly no much older people, from like our grandparents' generation. None of them are in there. Okay? This is all, people in their late 20s to maybe mid 30s max. And that's the millennials right now. That's it. Okay? And they think they know what's going on. They think they have it figured out. They think they know the woes of the world. No, they know what the mainstream media and their socialist professors told them. That's what they know, because they've been put through the gauntlet, through the ringer of outcome-based education, which is Soviet-style education based upon former Nazi-style education, based upon former Prussian military-style education. And if you don't understand that, again, you haven't been paying attention. You're not awake. You don't know where the modern education system comes from or the former systems of education that it was influenced by. Okay? So what I'm trying to explain to people is real methods of education to get people out of this type of a mindset. And the real method of education is the classical liberal arts education methodology known as the trivium and quadrivium, which we talk about here a lot on What on Earth is Happening. These people, none of them, the classical liberal arts education methodologies were all pulled from the schools of these people long before their birth. Okay? They are not involved in true critical thinking methodologies. They're not involved in real scientific methodology. Really never have been in the schools that they went to. And that's why they came out, outcome-based education. They came out of that gauntlet that they were put through, thinking exactly what the engineers who built that system of indoctrination want them to think. That's how social engineering works, folks. And people are just too overly educated to acknowledge that they were duped and put through that ringer. They don't want to admit that to themselves. Largely also because they're still drowning in probably hundreds of thousands of dollars of school debt. So-called education debt. Okay? So, this lifestyle leads to them basically not even making enough and being in debt so much that they can't even eke out a modest living. And then they want to blame capitalism for that. Look, I'm not your, huge proponent of capitalism and monetary systems and everything like that. I'm a proponent of higher consciousness and true spirituality. And a lot of the selfish assholes that you find on the other side of the spectrum when it comes to being radical capitalists, they don't understand a thing about real spirituality. There are people in the anarchist movement that say they're anarcho-capitalists, and they say the word spirituality has no meaning to them. Consciousness is a meaningless term. Well, left-brain asshole is a meaningful term to me, which is what those kind of people are, And, these people are just as imbecilic, because they think that the state should take care and provide for everybody. Like a benevolent parent, that's going to take care of them from cradle to grave and provide for their every need. So in a recent poll conducted in America, they just basically asked a bunch of people from many different states and many different walks of life and age groups, provide the definition of socialism. And of course, the socialism is the means of production and distributions of goods are in the hands of the state, basically. That's if people basically just answered that, or even said, publicly, collectively, whatever, the means of production and distribution of goods is in the hands of the state. is in the hands of the public or the state, they would have been gauged the correct answer. Okay. And in doing that, only 16% of millennials actually gave the correct answer of what socialism was, when I'm going to read you an article now coming up that talks about over 58% of millennials want there to be socialism or don't want capitalism. And yet only 16% when polled, could provide a correct answer of what socialism even is. Americans in general only did twice as well. Americans above 30 years old, only 30% of them correctly gave the answer, less than a third, approximately 1/3. It's disgraceful that people can't give a simple definition of what socialism is, you know? And yet, you know, over half of them are going to be advocating for it. I'm going to pause the presentation right here, and I want to go to an article. Okay? So I'm going to switch over to my web browser. You can cut back to the browser, and we'll go back to the presentation, but I want to read this article now. Okay, it's from the Washington Times, not the most reputable source, but I'll tell you what, I believe the article that they're writing right now, that they're publishing right now. Okay, so they did a poll where they polled millennials and asked them, would you rather live in a socialist or communist nation than under capitalism? And guess what, folks? In this article, they actually also said, if fascism was a choice, would you accept that over capitalism? Okay, so it says this troubling turn highlights widespread historical illiteracy in American society. Now, for the Washington Times saying that, folks, okay, this is how radically off base this poll got. That even the Washington Times published that this is troubling, and it indicates widespread historical illiteracy from a paper that I would say, you know, isn't the most trustworthy source in the world. Okay. However, it at least tells the truth in this article, which I'm going to read. Okay. So here's some former, Soviet, leaders, including Lenin and Stalin, busts there shown. It says the majority of millennials would prefer to live in a socialist, communist, or fascist nation rather than a capitalistic one, according to a new poll. And I just want to read that first statement again. Listen to this, folks. If this doesn't trouble and worry you, you need your head screwed on straight, because it's not. Okay? The majority of millennials would prefer to live in a socialist, communist, or fascist nation rather than a capitalistic one, according to a new poll. In the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's annual report on U.S. attitudes towards socialism, 58% of the up-and-coming generation opted for one of the three systems, either socialism, communism, or fascism, compared to 42% who said they were in favor of capitalism. The most popular socioeconomic order was socialism, with 44% support. Communism and fascism received 7% support each. So again, they are for the stepping stone to communism, which is socialism. Marion Smith, executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, said the report shows millennials are increasingly turning away from capitalism and towards socialism and even communism as a viable alternative. This troubling turn highlights widespread historical illiteracy in American society regarding socialism and the systemic failure of our education system to teach students about the genocide, destruction, and misery caused by communism since the Bolshevik Revolution 100 years ago, Mr. Smith said in a statement. Millennials are more likely to prefer socialism and communism rather than the rest of the country. 59% of all correspondents chose capitalism as their preferred arrangement compared to 34% who said socialism, 4% fascism, and 3% communism. Some of communism's luminaries are admired by millennials. 31% said they have a favorable view of Che Guevara. 32% had a favorable view of Karl Marx. 23% had a favorable view of Vladimir Lenin, and 19% had a favorable view of Mao Zedong. Okay? Think about that, folks. That's 1 in 5 thought that Chairman Mao was an admirable human being who, indirectly, as a dictator, led to the deaths of an estimated 90 million people. Okay? That's an admirable soul. Joseph Stalin was viewed favorably by just 6%. In the poll, only 33% of millennials were able to identify the correct definition of socialism in this poll, where they largely favored it. Still only 33%. That nationwide poll I just showed you, only 16% could tell you what socialism was. Only 33% in the very poll in which 58% said that they would live in a system, either socialism, communism, or fascism. Out of them, only 33 were able to identify correctly the definition of socialism. They fared about as well as the rest of the country, which only successfully identified socialism at a 34% clip. Generation Z, the generation after the millennials, was the most informed group, with 43% correctly identifying socialism. You see, the younger generation isn't taking the bullshit. They're not taking the indoctrination as well as this Generation Y class of individuals. Just swallowed it down. Like I said, they funnel it down the gullet, okay, with a funnel and a fire hose, okay. Forget spooning it in. Can't get it in there fast enough. Throw a funnel down the throat, get the hose in there, and just turn the valve on as fast as it can pump it in. That's how fast we got to get that propaganda down the gullet, okay. So where millennials struggled compared to other generations was in the identification of capitalism. Just 51% correctly said capitalism is the economic system based on free markets and the rule of law with legal protections for private ownership. That was by far the lowest of any age cohort. Americans as a whole correctly identified capitalism 67% of the time. Millennials are also less likely to have a negative view of communism. Just 36% said they had a very unfavorable impression of communism, and only 44% said they would be insulted if they were described as a communist. Think about that. That means that 56% of the millennial generation said they would not even be offended if they were described by someone else as a communist. Could you imagine that? This is who, many of the people who listen to my show, these are your children. Okay? That's all I have to say. All right? This is the job you did, raising children. All right? And then people want to say, go pump out as many kids as you can. This is one of the reasons I haven't had children. Okay? Because this is the kind of job people do, raising them, or I should say not raising them. All right? As a whole, 56% of Americans view communism very unfavorably. That's tragically low. That should be 100%. Only 56 view it very unfavorably. And 63% would be insulted to be associated with the ideology. One possible explanation for the millennial infatuation with socialism is that 53% of the cohort reports feeling burdened by the economy. So because they feel economically burdened, they think we should trash any form of capitalism and have a socialist system by which the state controls everything and just metes it out to people as they deem fit for their needs. Yeah, it's worked so well. It's Just look at it historically, you know. Forms of socialism have been responsible for the deaths of over 250 million people in the 20th century alone. That's 250 million souls. It's worked so well. As a matter of fact, it's worked exactly as intended, folks. It's worked exactly as intended. Millennials were the only age group more likely to say America's economic system works against me rather than for me. Generation Z had the most positive impression of the economy, with 66% saying it works for me, although many of them have yet to enter the workforce. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation survey was conducted online from September 28th to October 5th. It polled 2,300 members of the general public age 16 and above. All right, so we can cut away from that for a moment. I'll switch back to my slide presentation. I think that was a very pertinent article to view and to, explain to people that that is exactly what is going on in our culture. So to go back to the slides, this was that national poll. Only 16% of millennials in the whole country were able to identify correctly what socialism was by definition. So you could see why millennials have this attitude, okay, and why they're identifying with it. They're poorly schooled. They're poorly educated. And, I'm not talking about compulsory schooling. I'm talking about they're not educated at all. They're not truly educated. They're indoctrinated. And again, that's due to the Gramsci plan. Look it up, okay? Understand that stems out of Europe. And that's another reason that Europeans have a lot of the same mentality as well, okay? But look up the Gramsci plan of the long march through the institutions that came out of the Frankfurt School, inspired by Antonio Gramsci. Okay, that's Gramsci, Gramsci. The long march through the cultural institutions. Understand that was their plan. They did it through education, through cultural infiltration of the educational system in America and throughout all of Europe, okay? And they put communist professors in these areas that were Soviet or outright Chi-Com in their mindset, okay? And they put them into these positions of education, high-level positions, university, tenured at university, and they just absolutely let the floodgates loose, brainwashing the American and European public of young people. Okay, they knew that that's how they were going to hit the population, going to educated, cultured centers where people would, propagate the ideas out to the next generation down below them. And that's exactly what happened.